I see statements made that Mr. Trump proposes to give Mr. Putin everything he wants. Well, Mr. Putin already has the territories in Ukraine. He already has won the war for all intents and purposes. If the war goes on, he will take more of Ukraine. And what Mr. Trump is doing, it seems to me, is recognizing the realities that the war has produced. And those are unfortunate. They have been particularly unfortunate for the Ukrainians, who may have lost as many as 1 million men in the battles, who have been depopulated, deindustrialized, de-democratized, and who are remain the poorest and most corrupt society in Europe.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking once more to the outspoken Ambassador Chas Freeman, who, among many other positions, served as US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia and later became Assistant Secretary of Defense back in the 1990s. He also was Richard Nixons' principal interpreter during his 1972 visit to China, which led to the normalization of US-China relations. Ambassador Freeman, great to have you back.
Nice to be with you, Pascal.
Well, you've been talking quite a lot recently on various programs and helping us to understand the situation of current affairs, especially of US foreign policy. And I wanted to ask you first about your interpretation of this peace process that seems to be going on between the US and Russia. How do you make sense of it? And do you think this ceasefire proposal that was floated and that now is being discussed has serious chances of success?
Well, it is very hard to make sense of all this. My own supposition is that President Trump wants a broad rapprochement and engagement with Russia to replace the current hostility. And the issue of Ukraine is a means to that end, rather than ending the war in Ukraine being an end in itself. And in trying to engineer this, the American administration has confronted a number of difficulties. Obviously, the demonization of Mr. Putin, the vilification of Russia, the national consensus, which has seen a grave threat from Russia to Europe and to NATO, stands in the way of any policy. Mr. Trump, however, doesn't seem to be much inhibited by public opinion. He is able to break through it, and that is a good thing. The obstacles to any negotiation to end the war are pretty obvious. The major one actually has been the adamant refusal of Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of, maybe not constitutional president, but leader of Ukraine, to engage in any kind of negotiation on any subject. And I note that even though in return for a resumption of intelligence and material support during the talks in Jeddah, right after they concluded, he came out and reiterated that he would not negotiate any cession of territory to Russia. So it's not clear how serious he is about agreeing to a negotiation with the Russians. The major achievement of those talks in Jeddah, however, was the agreement by Zelensky to negotiate with the Russians. The ceasefire was an incidental thing. In many ways, it was more a ceasefire between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky than anything else. It was an offer of a ceasefire to Russia, arranged at the instance of the United States. But I think even those in the United States who came up with this proposal realized that it had very minimal prospects for actually happening. And we turn to the Russian side. The Russians have been very consistent over the years, holding to the 3 demands that they made in December 2021. to bring this war to an end and to achieve a peace in Europe. Those three demands are essentially protection for Russian speakers in Ukraine, which Russia now insists is to be accomplished through its annexation, legal recognition of its annexation of all four of the oblasts in eastern Ukraine, which are predominantly Russian-speaking, as well as, of course, Crimea, which is also predominantly Russian-speaking. So that is an issue that suggests that there can be no progress in the negotiations if Mr. Zelensky reserves the position he now has, which is that he will not make territorial concessions. Second demand for the Russians, the most important one in many ways, was that Ukraine return to the neutrality in which it was born. Ukraine was recognized by Russia at its independence on the basis of a provision in its constitution and policy statements that declared it would remain neutral and not a member of any bloc. Of course, since then, Ukraine has been persuaded to apply to NATO for membership, and this has become a major campaign issue for Mr. Zelensky and the Ukrainians, as well as for some Europeans who embrace this position. I note here, however, that Mr. Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, now openly admits that NATO membership is no longer on the table for Ukraine. So neutrality essentially means, in this context, and I recognize I'm speaking to an expert on neutrality, but I think in this case, it means no hostile forces on Ukrainian territory directed at Russia. The Russians initially put forward a lot of ancillary demands about armament levels and so forth on the part of the Ukrainians. I think all these things are negotiable, but neutrality is not. So essentially, to tie these two things together, Russia has been demanding a version of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. That is a treaty which would guarantee the neutrality of Ukraine. It would not join any military bloc, but would also protect minorities in Ukraine in accordance with the CSCE, Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, rules, which provide that minorities should have the right to cultural autonomy and to use their own language for limited purposes, even in a state which is where the major official language is something else. Austria has been a good example of this. Austria has been neutral. It is democratic. It is prosperous. Its various minorities, Italians in the Tyrol, Slovenes, Hungarians, and others have all enjoyed exemplary recognition of their cultural and linguistic autonomy. So this is essentially what the Russians are demanding. There is a third demand, however, which is far more complex and which at the moment is very contentious, and that is that there be a renegotiation of the security architecture in Europe to create a system in which Russia does not feel a threat from NATO and NATO does not feel a threat from Russia. The problem here is going back to what I said earlier about American public opinion, and that is the successful vilification of Russia and the exaggeration of a Russian threat. This seems to have been fully internalized by most Europeans. So we see now a discussion going on among Europeans, which is motivated by fear of American withdrawal from Europe, the abandonment of Europeans, or the conditioning of defense commitments under NATO, requiring the Europeans, after 80 years of relying on the United States to maintain order on their continent, to come up with some order of their own, and to do it, obviously, in cooperation with Russia, because Europe can't have a successful order if it excludes Russia and treats it as an enemy. But the Europeans seem to be still fixated on dividing Europe into rival military spheres of influence. And so, not rather than talking about political arrangements that might settle the Ukraine conflict and lead to an agreement on broad security and stability and peace in Europe, they are still talking about some things that are frankly fairly ridiculous, like peacekeepers in Ukraine, when there is no peace to keep. And when the peacekeepers would come from NATO, which which means that the very reason the Russians went to war would be violated. Russia went to war to keep NATO out of Ukraine. So this is really silly talk, and it is the silliness is compounded by the statement of people like Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, who says, of course, we put troops on the ground in Ukraine, but they'd have to be backed by the United States. Well, the United States has made it abundantly clear it has had enough of Ukraine. So anyway, and all of this is premised on delusional views of reality. I see statements made that Mr. Trump proposes to give Mr. Putin everything he wants. Well, Mr. Putin already has the territories in Ukraine. He already has won the war for all intents and purposes. If the war goes on, he will take more of Ukraine. And so what Mr. Trump is doing, it seems to me, is recognizing the realities that the war has produced. And those are unfortunate. They have been particularly unfortunate for the Ukrainians, who may have lost as many as 1 million men in the battles, who have been depopulated, deindustrialized, de-democratized, and who are remain the poorest and most corrupt society in Europe. So this is when you ask, make sense of all this. It's got multiple parts. It's not easy to make sense of it. And we don't know, on top of this, what the skill level of the American diplomats involved is. We know that Sergei Lavrov and Ryabkov and others on the Russian side are very experienced. Mr. Lavrov has 45 years of diplomatic experience, and he demonstrates it when he speaks. Marco Rubio has 45 days experience. So we don't know how feasible an agreement might be, given the untested nature of some of the people who would have to negotiate it. So I'll stop here. That's a lot. I apologize for going on at such length.
No, that is very useful, and you are touching right on two more things I want to ask about. I mean, the skill level is of course one. I talked the other day to Michael von der Schulenburg, who used to be a top UN negotiator, and he was intimately involved also in the Iran-Iraq ceasefire and peace negotiations back in the late 80s. And his interpretation is that this approach towards a ceasefire is actually very skillfully done from both sides, the US and Russia, because the US managed to offer something that they can potentially implement because the Ukraine is on a much shorter leash now, and Russia is now asking for the settlement of details of how to implement, and that this is, in his view, a very skilled way of approaching the issue. Maybe I ask you about this, but then the second thing that I wonder is if, in your experience, what the UK and France and the Europeans are doing at the moment of talking about boots on the ground and also using this language that goes back to the second Iraq war, of the coalition of the willing, is not only not skilled, but potentially the role of a spoiler in the process of trying to create a condition under which, from outside interference, even if it is not a powerful interference, might actually halt the process as it is. Do you see that as a danger?
Well, that's really two questions. And
Yes.
let me start with the second. I think the Europeans are not at the table because they have no peace proposal at all. So putting them at the table would be disruptive. It would not accomplish anything. They need to come up with a peace proposal. And by that, I mean a political formula, not a perpetuation of military conflict and confrontation. I don't know whether they can do that or not. In my experience, committees of, let's say, a dozen people have a great deal of difficulty reaching conclusions and sticking with them. They're not good at making decisions. When you have 27 countries, it's even more complicated. And the divisions between Europeans are very obvious. There is no consensus at all. And so they have defaulted to the lowest common denominator, which is continued military confrontation. And that just won't qualify them for anything. But this brings me to the first point. I think, in fact, one has to parse. I should go back before I leave the Europeans. I would say that the confusion among Europeans, the lack of consensus, and more particularly the lack of any kind of diplomatic proposal at all, is why the Trump administration was wise not to try to include them and to operate over their head directly with the Russians at Riyadh. This made sense, and I think it was well executed. Second, going to the issue of the overall process, as I think we have not parsed the Russian response correctly. The Russians have accepted the idea of a ceasefire with, quote, nuances, unquote. I understand this is actually a vulgar joke in Russian, but because the word nuance sounds something like the male genital apparatus. But I don't speak Russian, so I don't hold me to that. These are not nuances, these are basic principles. And they are, as I described them, the principles put forward as part of the ultimatum of December 2021. And they are the principles enshrined in the draft treaty that was concluded at Istanbul in late March 2022, a few weeks after the invasion, by which Ukraine agreed to neutrality and to no longer pursue membership in NATO. And I believe there was an effort to restore the Minsk Accords, which would have allowed for the autonomy of Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine. I'm not so sure about that, because there had been a civil war that went on for 8 years in which a lot of people died. And I think the Russians now have come to the firm conclusion that the only protection for their fellow Russian speakers in Ukraine is separate sovereignty, not under Ukraine, as they had agreed. So Mr. Putin's reaction was actually very deft. He said, well, you've asked for a ceasefire. I agree there should be a ceasefire, but it should be part of a peace and a peace process. So let's work on the peace process so we can get to the ceasefire. Why did he do that? Well, as I say, it's deft. He does not want to have what happened to Zelensky in the Oval Office happen to his relationship with Donald Trump. He does not want to cross Donald Trump. He understands, to go back to my original thesis, that there is a great deal in this for Russia if Russia can normalize relations with the United States and pursue, as was agreed at Riyadh, both geopolitical and economic cooperation between America and Russia. So I think Mr. Putin has his eye on the grand bargain that might be struck. Ukraine, I have to say, sadly, Ukraine has never been the central issue here. Ukraine was regarded by the United States and NATO as a tool with which to, quote, weaken and isolate Russia. That hasn't worked. it was regarded by Mr. Putin as a symptom, an example of the cost of not having a decent security architecture in Europe. All of the propaganda that has insisted that Mr. Putin wants to take all of Ukraine has no basis, in fact. There's been no such claim by the Russians. Or the propaganda that says that his intent is to march through Ukraine to Paris, and as the Tsar did after defeating Napoleon. This is not. Neither of these theses are correct, and Europe has essentially allowed itself to, as I put it, inhale its own propaganda, become a bit drunk with the lies that accompany a tremendously intense information warfare campaign. And Europe is a bit panicked now because, on the one hand, the United States is no longer seen as reliable, and it is seen as reaching over the heads of Europe and making a deal with Russia. And Europe is not prepared to deal with these circumstances because since 1945, it has been content to rely on the United States to maintain peace and stability on the continent. And it has not devised its own means of doing so. So we now have all sorts of things going on among Europeans. The French are offering to extend nuclear deterrent umbrella to all of Europe, involving the Germans talking quietly about their own nuclear weapon, the British having committed Brexit, which reduces their influence in Europe and in the United States, both, quite concerned about their reliance on the United States for their own nuclear deterrent. And people in Europe saying all kinds of things. I noted that Kaja Kallas, who is the head of the European foreign policy apparatus, and a lawyer, demonstrated precisely why lawyers are poor diplomats. She said, we can't talk to Mr. Putin, he's a war criminal. But, diplomacy is all about dialogue. And no, you don't have to imagine that the person you're conducting a dialogue with is either saintly or free of sin, or in any way desirable personality. You have to be pragmatic. Europe is not being pragmatic.
I utterly agree. And maybe my last question on this topic is, to me, it seems that the Europeans are currently learning exactly the wrong lesson, and that they're so deeply entrenched in this mindset that you also laid out, that they're now conducting or starting to conduct policies that are going to be extremely hurtful to themselves, especially rearmament. That now rearmament, also in Germany, is en vogue again and is possible again. This, to me, is highly dangerous, especially if you do it out of the motivation of a non-existing threat, an imaginary threat that you conjure up yourself. This is a recipe to disaster. Do you also have that fear, or do you see it in a different way?
No, I think that's very right. Among other things, all this talk, although I think many Russians discount the potential for the Europeans actually to accomplish very much, does lay the basis for a continuing military confrontation in Europe, rather than a Europe whole and free, as everyone wanted, including the Russians. We're seeing this kind of thing leading to the perpetual military division of Europe. Beyond that, this is enormously expensive, and a burden on economies that aren't doing terribly well. If you look at the world's great economic economies, the United States is now in a very strangely volatile situation, given the erratic policies of our president. Someone in the Financial Times wrote the other day that if you're reading this column on any day of the week that ends in DAY, which of course they all do, then Mr. Trump has either imposed tariffs, reversed them, adjusted them, or threatened them on somebody or other. And allies, foes are treated the same. And of course, we have other complications like the absurd claim to Greenland and the bullying of Panama. And anyway, this is not exemplary or congenial foreign policy, and it's very objectionable to the Europeans, understandably, and not to mention the Latin Americans and others. But if you look at, the Chinese economy is doing fine. It's got slower growth than it did, and there's a lot of schadenfreude about this. But really, it's marching ahead. And the Europeans are not. Europe is in the doldrums, with Germany deindustrializing as a result of the removal of cheap Russian energy, which had powered the German economy, and France in a state of crisis with Algeria, which is not a good thing for France, and so forth. So this is not the moment, probably, to come up with some grand scheme for a pan-European military-industrial complex, pan-European bond issuance to finance defense modernization and expansion, and what, a common army? Where is that? There is an issue to be worked out with the United States, clearly, and that is a readjustment of responsibilities within NATO. Mr. Trump, in his very mercenary manner, is actually calling for that. When he calls for additional contributions by Europeans, he's basically saying what his defense secretary said at the Munich Security Conference. Europe, you're going to be on your own, and we're turning our attention to opposing China, and we're turning our attention to the Pacific. So Europe has to adjust to this, and there should be an agreement. There should be a negotiating process. This shouldn't be left to chance. What happens to NATO? Does it get a European commander? I think it should, but that isn't an easy thing.
Maybe very, very last point on this, because I think it's significant. We've heard for the longest time from NATO that Ukraine's path to NATO is irreversible. They used the term irreversible. And now, like a few days ago, Mark Rutte was sitting next to US President, even just nodding when the US President said, we want to annex Greenland, just nodding and being conciliatory, and then later saying like, yeah, no membership to NATO for Ukraine. I mean, the irreversible course has now been reversed. Is this a surprise, or do you think this sends any kind of signals also to the Europeans to make it clear, utterly clear, what this military alliance is about?
Well, the Europeans shouldn't have had to have this reminder. After all, the essence of NATO is Article 5, which says that an attack on one member is an attack on all, and all have the responsibility to respond. But NATO has made it abundantly clear that it's not prepared to go to war with Russia over Ukraine directly. All it's prepared to do is conduct a proxy war, and which it has been doing, by the way, starting in February 2022, but starting right after the coup in 2014, when there was an enormous effort begun to retrain, re-equip, and restructure the Ukrainian armed forces against Russia. In fact, on the eve of the war breaking out in February 2022, Ukrainian forces were poised to try to invade the Donbass, the so-called People's Republics, and eliminate them. That was their objective. And you look at the reports from the time, and you'll see an enormous increase in violations of the so-called ceasefire, almost all from the Ukrainian side. So, it should have been obvious. It was obvious to many people that Ukraine was never going to be in NATO. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed is a little tiny bit of honesty creeping in to the NATO rhetoric. And that is a result of Mr. Trump's rather brutal approach to all this. And again, that has been salutary. It's been healthy, in my view. And the Europeans, they're bewildered, they're confused, they are sticking with the old libretto. That was Zelensky's problem. He went to the Oval Office and sang the old song, Russia's evil, Putin's a demon, you can't trust anything the Russians do. And the audience walked out on him, or actually shoved him out of the room. That aria doesn't play anymore.